Good evening, good afternoon, rather. Seems like evening, doesn't it? This is our final session of the annual meeting, and we have a subject of resistance and memory, free and enslaved laborers in Mississippi. And our speakers are Lisa Childs. Lisa is working on her MA in history at the University of Arkansas. She has a JD from Loyola University of Chicago, a PhD in genetics from North Carolina State University, and is a patent attorney. Last year, she received the Susie Pryor Award for the best unpublished essay in Arkansas women's history for her article on women homesteaders in those foothills. Our next speaker is Cassie Turnipseed. Dr. Turnipseed is a community outreach specialist and teacher of public and African-American world histories at both Jackson State and Mississippi Valley State Universities. After earning her BA in radio and television from San Francisco State University and an MS in telecommunications and an MBA in international business from Golden State University in San Francisco. Dr. Turnipseed relocated to the Mississippi Delta in 2009 and worked as the inaugural director of community outreach and education for the B.B. King Museum and Delta Interpretive Center in Indianola. After serving in that capacity for 3 years, she earned her PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University. Welcome, ladies, and we look forward to your presentation.
In July 1858, the enslaved people on Mrs. James K. Polk's planting estate in Yalobusha County in northern Mississippi had had enough. Perhaps a year earlier, Mrs. Polk had started the process of involving her newly acquired nephew by marriage, James Monroe Avent, in owning and running the place, and changes were afoot, which meant that they were vulnerable, more vulnerable than usual. When the longtime overseer sought to punish one of them, the others interfered and rescued the culprit. They then barricaded themselves in the gin house. 5 days later, 75 white men ended the standoff. 4 enslaved people went to jail, and 2 were indicted for insurrection and assault and battery. Mrs. Polk and her attorneys pursued various avenues to get them released. Eventually, they were released on bond, pending a new trial. Before the new trial came about, the Civil War intervened. Today, I plan to tell some of their story. The enslaved people in Mrs. Polk's planting estate had a history of challenging decisions, as documented in surviving correspondence with the President and Mrs. Polk and their overseers, and is written about by Dusenberry and Greenberg. The enslaved people traveled to Tennessee to object. They sent word by relatives of the Polks that they were unhappy. They walked off periodically, and in 1858, they stopped work. In February 1857, Sarah Polk's niece, Mary Childress, was getting married. Sarah's husband, President James K. Polk, had died 9 years earlier, and Sarah had been running the businesses he left her, including one in Yalobusha County. It had grown in value since they bought it in 1834, and perhaps Sarah was concerned about whether Mary's husband could support her on his lawyer's income. Or maybe she was tired of dealing with letters from overseers and visits from enslaved people demanding that she do better. At any rate, at some point in 1857 or 1858, Mrs. Polk and James Avent began negotiating a transfer of a share of the planting estate. The term planting estate included the land and equipment and the 56 enslaved people whose labor was critical to making the land produce cotton, which in turn produced the money that Mrs. Polk and now James Avent could use to support themselves back in Tennessee. Avent was in politics with his Sarah's brother, Mary's father. They were both active in the Democratic Party in Rutherford County, Tennessee, and honestly, at 40, he was closer in age to Mary's father and Sarah than he was to Mary's 23. But he still needed his own 70-year-old father to co-sign loans for him. Avent and Mrs. Polk didn't end up finishing the deal until January 1860, 18 months after the enslaved people on her estate participated in what the press called almost an insurrection. I want to acknowledge here that words matter. This is not the sort of insurrection we saw January 6. Nobody stormed a seat of governmental power. Nobody died. This insurrection came about when these enslaved people tried to protect their own. The only weapons they were accused of using were their work tools, and they sought shelter in the gin house, probably the only building big enough to house the dozen families living on the place, and the building most emblematic of their work as enslaved people, turning their unpaid labor into Mrs. Polk's money. This was a community act by enslaved people pushing back against something they saw as unjust or threatening. And in contrast to many other pushbacks, where the white community lynched Black people based on rumors and speculation, this didn't end in the death of Black people, not even the men charged as ringleaders, Manuel Young and Giles Polk. July 1858 probably opened with a 4th of July celebration, a barbecue and a reading of the Declaration of Independence. Giles Polk's wife, Daphne, knew their daughter was born July 4th, for it was on a day when there was a big barbecue in the neighborhood. Dempsey Pitts, who had been enslaved nearby, remembered that the 4th of July was the day for the big barbecue dinner. No work that day, nothing but feast and merrymaking. July continued unusually wet. A white man remembered decades later how the Tallahatchie River had an overflow which inundated the whole delta and was most destructive. There was scarcely a crop of cotton or corn that escaped its ravages. Hundreds of deer were drowned. Late July on into August was always an in-between time, a time between the cotton working season and the cotton picking season. The enslaved people would be preparing for fall, tending food crops and getting ready for the cotton harvest. The cotton baskets and sacks needed to be made and the gin house cleaned out so that all was ready once the cotton bolls opened. On a Friday in late July 1858 in Yalobusha County, all eyes were on the weather. Weather is never just one thing or the other. The rivers were finally receding and some farms on the bottoms were unscathed, while others entirely ruined. Animal carcasses were gradually appearing with the stench from decomposition of animal as well as vegetable matter not to be endured. Yalobusha County had seen some rain on Wednesday, and a shower on Thursday had laid the dust in town and cooled the atmosphere. Although all remained somewhat encouraged about the prospects for cotton, corn will unquestionably be short. Rain is wanted. Hot suns and dry weather have caused nearly everything to languish and die. In the midst of this, on Friday, July 23rd, the overseer, John Mayers, undertook to whip one of the hands when the others interfered and rescued the culprit. Mayers was a timid man and afraid, so he went for help, while everybody on the place barricaded themselves in the gin house and armed themselves with whatever they could find: axes, hatchets, clubs, scythes, stones, etc. They swore they would die, then be whipped. After a 5-day standoff, 75 white men arrested everyone on the place. And in the melee, a white neighbor, James Kirkendall Duke, was struck by a club. Judge Ephraim Stone Fisher was newly retired from the Mississippi High Court and held a trial on the place the next morning and sent 4 ringleaders, to jail. The balance, some 50 or 60, were whipped according to their several deserts and sent home. Just 2 of the ringleaders, Giles Polk and Manuel Young, are known for certain, but I believe the other 2 were named Jerry and Joe. Manuel Young was part of a family the Polks had bought from other Polk relatives in 1834, while 4 years earlier, in 1831, Polk had bought Giles. He was then about 13. The Polks bought Giles' future wife, Daphne, in 1839, and Manuel's wife, Jane Russell, in 1846. By 1858, Giles and Manuel were in their late 30s with a good start on their families. Manuel had married Jane Russell 8 or 10 years earlier. They had already buried at least 2 babies, with 3 little ones underfoot and a 4th one on the way. His sisters and brother were living on the place. His brother Alfonso had married Mariah Davis, and they had at least 3 little ones, with the latest baby, Eliza, born in early June. Giles and Daphne had 4 or 5 living children and had buried at least 2. Between Giles's family and Manuel's family, they were related to about a third of the enslaved people on the Polk place and had been working and living with most of the rest for 10 years or more. These ties within the enslaved community may explain both why they were the ringleaders of a group which banded together for 5 days in the gin house, and also why Sarah Polk put up such a robust defense of them and spent so much money to bond them out. If they were convicted of insurrection and executed by the state of Mississippi, the enslaved community would have been devastated. She might have had to sell off the entire community, which by this point was a good bit of her estate. And enslaved people who were part of an insurrection, even if not the ringleaders, would be sold at a discount. The other 2 likely ringleaders, Joe and Jerry, are a little more puzzling. I think they were Joe and Jerry because, like Giles and Manuel, they were removed from the planting estate 2 years later. That leaves the question of who were they? I'm still not positive, but I think they're the same Joe and Jerry in the 1850 inventory of President Polk's estate. Jerry might be Jerry Roseman, who was living with Manuel Young in 1870. If so, he was from South Carolina and a little older than Giles and Manuel. Since Joe was valued the same as Manuel in 1850, he is probably about the same age. All were solidly in adulthood. While the idea of insurrection certainly troubled white people, enslaved people had had no great success in insurrection in the United States for nearly 20 years. Rumors of insurrection had periodically surfaced across the South, and white Southerners had become exceedingly irritable. In 1856, these rumors erupted across the South and resulted in Black men being killed with or without a trial, even though these rumors had no substance. A Northern observer summed it up. The papers from the Southern states continue to be filled with accounts of reported insurrectionary movements, nearly all of which, when sifted calmly, have thus far proved to be without much foundation. The usual course pursued, wherever such rumors gain credit, is to seize a number of them and either hang them under the excitement of mob law or whip them until a confession is obtained, and this is set down as the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The Natchez Free Trader dismissed insurrection rumors as humbug, poodle doodle stuff, physical, mental, and moral absurdities. Enslaved people are incapable of any aspirations for freedom and therefore incapable of plots and insurrections. Again, after the July 1858 almost insurrection, in summer of 1860, white people's worries resurfaced across Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, triggered not only by the looming presidential election, but by the fires that spread across Texas, fires which white Texans were sure were part of a statewide conspiracy among enslaved Black Texans who died as a result. So why didn't the white people of Yalobusha County take this July 1858 uprising as a threat that needed to be squelched by mob action before the law could stop it? I'm not really sure. It wasn't a presidential election year, so tensions were lowered somewhat. Enslaved people holed up in their own gin house instead of roaming across the countryside, encouraging others to join them. That helped. It being a single planting estate with just an overseer in charge allowed white people to see this episode as a one-off, a timid man being in charge rather than a threat to the institution of slavery. The first round of pretrial proceedings took place in Coffeyville in early November 1858. The grand jury found that Miles and Manuel and Giles did conspire with each other and diverse other slaves whose names are unknown to make insurrection and to intentionally resist the lawful authority of the overseer by arming themselves. Manuel was also charged with assault and battery on Jacob Kirkendall Duke. The other 2 ringleaders were discharged and sent home. After the indictment, Giles and Manuel were sent to the Yalobusha County Jail, where they apparently remained as late as January 1860. Giles and Manuel's attorney moved to relocate the trial to Charleston, Tallahatchie County's seat, probably arguing that it would be impossible to draw a fair jury in a county where 75 of the jury pool had participated in storming the gin house. The judge granted the motion and moved the trial to Tallahatchie County. Insurrection was a capital crime with a mandatory sentence of death by hanging. Mississippi law required Giles and Manuel to be tried in the circuit court, represented by counsel, their guilt or innocence determined by a jury, not of their peers, but of white slave-owning men. Sarah Polk hired as their lawyer Judge Fisher, the same man who held the initial trial on the Polk place. Insurrection required proof of an armed assembly having intent to resist or subvert lawful authority. Insurrection had to be more than mere insubordination and more than just running away. Manuel Young's charge of assault and battery was not a capital crime. It was serious, though. His sentence, if convicted, would be any number of lashes on the bare back, not exceeding 100. Their attorney, Fisher, challenged the insurrection charge. He argued that lawful authority meant governmental authority, not the overseer's authority, which is derived from domestic relations. The judge rejected Fisher's argument. Fisher then filed a writ of habeas corpus in December of 1858. Writ of habeas corpus would let a judge consider letting someone out on bail, and the Mississippi High Court had just ruled that bail should be liberally granted, at least for white men. The judge, however, sent Giles and Manuel back to jail, doubtless because the Habeas Corpus Act barred discharge of slaves after commitment or indictment for any felony. Insurrection was a felony. Fisher appealed the denial of his writ of habeas corpus, and the High Court ruled against him in June 1859. In November 1859, 18 months after the almost insurrection, there was yet another jurisdictional move. Senator Taliaferro from Tallahatchie County sponsored a bill in the state legislature to change venue again, back to Yalobusha County. We're now reached January 1860. Giles and Manuel are still in the county jail awaiting trial. Mrs. Polk hasn't got them out on bond. Their wives have quit having babies, and she's ready to finish transferring a share of her estate to the Avets. Somehow, her attorney Fisher makes two things happen. One, they post $4,500 bond for Giles and Manuel, $1,500 on the assault and battery charge, and $3,000 on the insurrection charge. This is probably considerably more than the two men were worth standing alone, but perhaps a sensible valuation of the impact their continued absence had had on the value of the planting estate. And Giles and Manuel returned to the planting estate and to their wives and babies. The second thing, Mrs. Polk and the Avents work out a modified deal. The initial deal was for Mrs. Polk to sell an undivided half of the entire planting estate, the land, the buildings, the tools, and the 56 enslaved people. She valued this planting estate at $60,000, so the Avents would pay her $30,000 for their share in two installments, $15,000 when they closed, and another $15,000 plus interest in a year. And James Monroe Avent's 70-year-old daddy would guarantee that second payment. But before they closed, they changed things up. Mrs. Polk removed 6 enslaved people from the deed: Giles and Manuel, Jerry and Joe, and Marina and the child Edmund. This meant she didn't have to warrant that they were of sound mind and body, especially important since Giles and Manuel were still waiting for a trial where they might have been sentenced to death. They agreed that these 6 people were worth $7,500, which Mrs. Polk took out of the $15,000 Avent was to pay her when they closed. And the Avents agreed to move 6 of their enslaved people from Tennessee to Yalobusha County and into the planting estate. The Avents and Mrs. Polk agreed that these 6 people were also worth $7,500, so her half share in them was worth $3,750. The Avents, by transferring their enslaved people to Mississippi, literally made a deposit on the estate, converting enslaved human beings into capital. And just like that, the Avents had made most of their $15,000 down payment on the planting estate, leaving just $37.50 to be paid in some other form. And here the court and newspaper records go silent. Dusenberry assumed that the six were taken to Tennessee or sold, never to be seen again. However, that's not what happened, at least not for Giles and Manuel. In August 1863, 7 months after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in Mississippi, they and 8 other enslaved men, Perry, Lewis, Manuel's brother Alfonso, William, Wilson, Anderson, Jason, and Addison, left off hoeing the turnip patch on the Polk place to join the 2nd West Tennessee Infantry Regiment of African descent. In March 1864, 7 months later, Mrs. Polk and her new overseer asked the federal government to pay for taking 10 mules worth $3,000, 2 saddles and bridles worth $40, and 10 of her enslaved men, whom she claimed were worth $20,000 when taken. Some 7 months after the Emancipation Proclamation should have meant all enslaved people in Mississippi were no longer enslaved. Now, Avent wasn't there when they left, but by then he had the charge of it. It would be decades before Giles' widow, Daphne, and Manuel Young sought their military pensions. But that's another story. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Cassie Turnipseed, and I am an assistant professor of history at Jackson State University and a public historian and executive director of Coffray Inc. Today's presentation is on resistance and memory, and it's a tribute to cotton pickers of the American South. Today's presentation is in dedication to my father, Mr. Theodore Jim Turnipseed Sr., and he is a man who is from Mississippi and who picked cotton and never wanted or expected raw cotton to touch his fingers again. Cotton has such a painful memory within my family, my parents, and it really made me wonder why. So that soon became my passion, and my interest is to basically discover the reasons why so many African Americans are so traumatized by this beautiful plant called cotton. What I discovered was it is a fact that on slave plantations in the southern region of America, that it was primarily the forced and exploited labor of enslaved cotton pickers that created unimaginable profit for plantation owners and cotton merchants, bankers, insurance brokers, etc. And it was mainly the industrious North who benefited most. And so that common commerce, cotton, united North and South in a way it had never done before. Cotton, the raw cotton, played a dominant role in global exchange markets during the 18th and 19th through the 20th century. The United States constituted nearly 70% of the nation's total exports. Cotton supplied 7/8 of the world's supply, and New York merchants were the middlemen. And as I mentioned before, the greatest benefactors between the cotton in the American South and the cloth-making mills of Britain and France. Historically, however, cotton in most parts of Africa was a subsistence crop that grew in the gardens alongside the vegetables and other crops, and it was used for sustaining clothes and shelter, and not necessarily for capitalistic or exploitative ventures that evolved through the transatlantic slavery system and the colonial influence thereof. Cotton, as we can see, supplies many natural resources, and again, cotton and textiles were among them. There's a wonder that so large a supply of cotton could be procured from one source, the United States. And when we reflect this great wealth to European manufacturers and merchants, had also catapulted the United States onto center stage of the world economy, building the most successful agricultural industry which has ever been contemplated or realized. And this was written in 1861 by Thomas Bazley. As a result, in 1781, the world's first steam engine or steam-driven textile mill opened in England, and by 1871, 32% of the global cotton was produced out of Lancaster and Manchester, thereby becoming the largest and most productive cotton spinning center in the world. Soon after, Manchester transformed into the world's first industrial city by positioning itself at the epicenter of 280 cotton towns and villages within a 12-mile radius of the Royal Exchange and the cotton world market. Manchester's merchants serviced the cotton mills throughout Europe and to consumers throughout the world, particularly through its colonization efforts. Manchester's mills peaked at 108 in 1853, and hence the term Cottonopolis in 1870. Cotton indeed did become England's god. Everybody worshiped this commodity that was making them so much money. Cotton. Cotton is the thread, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in 1846. We have patriotism for holidays and summer evenings with music and rockets, but in practical terms, cotton threads hold this union together. And the future was bright. All looked bright for this nation. Its growth and trade was everything hoped for. But for the millions of enslaved people and indentured servants who were forced by American laws and practices to work for free, growing the world's most lucrative commodity, cotton, the cost was tremendous. As the 19th century began, land-hungry Americans poured into the backcountry of the coastal South and began moving towards and into what we know as Alabama and Mississippi. Since Native Americans living there appeared to be the main obstacles to westward expansion, white settlers petitioned the federal government to remove them. So, in cooperation with Cherokee chiefs such as John Ross, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. It was authorizing the president to grant unsettled lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within state borders. A few went peacefully, but many resisted the relocation. And the Indian Removal Act, this is the words of the President Andrew Jackson. He said, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government steadily pursued for nearly 30 years in relation to the removal of Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation. 2 important tribes have accepted the provision made for their removal at the last session of Congress, and it is believed that their example will induce the remaining tribes also to seek the same obvious advantages." And so many in Congress were complicit and expressed such. So the Trail of Tears is what resulted after the Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people were expelled from their lands in the 1830s. The New York and Mississippi Land Company bought the land and sold it to cotton planters. Cotton. Cotton was the essential reason why the Civil War was fought. Who was to maintain the control of the economic resources of the slave picked cotton? Cotton is not indigenous to the American South, but it is to Africa and Asia and some parts of South America. Cotton became the number one economic driver in America and probably the world for nearly 200 years. All industries combined did not equate to the profits of cotton. Families, entire families, worked together from kin to kin. Families tended to have more children in order to help out in the fields, and each member had a quota. You're going to meet a young man in a moment who, at the age of 14, had to pick 500 bales of cotton or 500 pounds of cotton, which is equivalent to a bale, every single day, or he would be beaten. Schools were closed during picking seasons. Hence, the education was compromised in many Southern communities, particularly amongst African Americans. Cotton provided the financial footing for Wall Street, the shipping and railroad industries, and the distribution centers in New Orleans and the Carolinas, New York, and all along the eastern shores that encompassed the Gullah Geechee territories. Cotton also enabled trust funds to be generated for several hundred years and still have not been exhausted even today. In regards to the Wall Street legislators, this is what and how the law read. In 1711, it said, "Be it ordained by the mayor, recorder, aldermen, and assistants of the city of New York, convened in the Common Council, and it is hereby ordained by the authority of the same that all Negro and independent slaves that are let out to hire within the city do take up their standing in order to be hired at the market house, at the Wall Street slip, until such time as they are hired, whereby all persons may know where to hire slaves, as their occasion shall require, and also masters discover when their slaves are so hired, and all the inhabitants of this city are to take notice hereof accordingly. So it commenced with the auctions and Negro sales throughout New York and other cities as well. But the resistance was always there. There were consistent new strategies being implemented by abolitionists, anti-slavery activists, and enslaved Africans throughout American history. Their motto was publicize, organize, and uplift, thereby exposing legions of people to the wrongs of slavery, Jim Crow, and Black Code laws, and the prejudice and the pure hatred that accompanied them. There were approximately one out of 10 slave ships that experienced insurrections and resistance. Of course, you know Harriet Tubman, also known as Moses, because the average enslaved African did not take slavery lying down. They resisted in every way that they could. Harriet led hundreds to freedom. She said, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If there's a shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. The Dred Scott decision, which was rendered by the Supreme Court, enshrined racist thinking in the law in its 1857 decision, ruling that African people, whether enslaved or free, came from a slave race and had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. Now, this belief became the root of the epidemic or endemic racism that we still see in this country today. However, African soldiers fought in every single war this country faced, despite living under harsh, inhumane conditions. We fought and died in every war. We've marched in every war. But when they signed the Constitution, African lives were worth only 3/5 of a white person's life. And of course, we were there to fight on the battlefields for our freedom in the Civil War. But as Frederick Douglass said in 1882, we have worked without wages, we have lived without hope, wept without sympathy, and bled without mercy. Though slavery was abolished, the wrongs of my people were not ended. They freed us, but they didn't change their attitudes about us. So therefore, you saw things like convict leasing, whereby African Americans in the South would be jailed indefinitely for crimes such as vagrancy, riding the rails, loitering, changing jobs, gambling, just talking would get you locked up and incarcerated and thereby back enslaved. The progress was being experienced, the progress of Black folks were being experienced all over the country, but particularly in places like Tulsa and Mound Bayou and others. But in this instance, in Tulsa, Greenwood, Oklahoma, it was destroyed by white racists in 1921, and you could see the devastation from this very, very prosperous and successful town. It's called Black Wall Street. And over 10,000 sundown cities existed in this country where whites only were allowed within city limits after dark. Blacks were forced into overcrowded ghettos in the city, and the misery continued even in the north. So that said, there are some important questions that we must ask. Why do young people today, or what do young people today need to enhance their self-esteem by way of education and instruction in our experience? And I'm speaking, of course, in regards to young African American people and their exposure to things that's going to enhance their self-esteem. But what needs to happen for all Americans to better understand and appreciate the significance of the long wage fight for justice and equality of formerly enslaved people, sharecroppers and tenant farmers and the like? But why have so many elders become silent about their stories and their personal fight for freedom and justice? And what should the return on investment or the return of their sweat equity investments in this country be, particularly in the Mississippi Delta and throughout the American South? When I posed that question or the answer to this beautiful lady who was 102 at the time, when I said, erect a monument and build a historic site that honors them, she just looked at me with this beautiful smile and just said, yes, baby. And this sister, I love her. Looked like she's saying, say what now? You gonna honor me? Yes, you deserve it and are worthy of honor. And it was Ralph Ellison who said, I am not ashamed of my grandparents or ancestors for having been enslaved or sharecropping cotton pickers. I am only ashamed of myself for having at one time been ashamed. Cotton pickers, the people who tilled, planted, chopped, picked, and spun cotton, were by every measure the hardest working people in America. They deserve our respect and not our shame. They showed up, they showed out, from kin to can't, from sun up to sundown. We did the work that had to be done. Cotton remains one of the most important exports worldwide, thereby giving a significance and substance to the argument that we must build a monument and commemorative site that respects the historic contributions of our ancestors globally. It is time to honor them. As Fannie Lou Hamer said, I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired. So we worked as a community through Mississippi Valley State University and its students to develop a historic marker where there was none, where Fannie Lou took her historic stance for the voting rights of all Americans. And it's there today. We unveiled it on October the 16th, 2020 for, it was on and in commemoration of her birthday, where she turned 103 years old. So I ask that you please do go by Sunflower County Courthouse and check out our sign. This was the first in tribute to the cotton pickers of America. And it's one of the beginning of the series that we will do in the process of developing the National Cotton Pickers Memorial Site in the Delta. There in the middle, there will be a 30-foot high statue in tribute to Grandmama Nim, and so to say thank you for picking all that doggone cotton. And I really envision this woman right here as me walking through those beautiful pearly gates to cotton pickers. And this is the site where we will tell that story of the African technology and knowing that came with the skills and the seeds from Africa. And then as enslavement ensued, these are bronze sculptures of cotton pickers, and from time to time we'll have reenactors there coming alive and telling their stories. And then we will also have interpretive artifacts that tell the story of the gin and the processing, and how overseers sat on their high horse and oversaw the process. And then here in sharecropping, we went from a system of enslavement here to a system of new enslavement. So it was a system of no pay to one of very low pay, and to where we are today with all the progress and accomplishments of former cotton pickers. And so here in the center is the 30-foot high monument. The Sharecroppers Interpretive Center and gift shop will be there on location, and all of the bricks will have engraved in them the names of people that we know were cotton pickers. I love how this depiction shows the ancestors just hovering and ever present as people come and go and enjoy the courtyard and experience the spirit and the energy of those folks who work so hard for us to have the life that we have today. So far, we have received support from every single person that we've asked support of. Dr. Maya Angelou was our inaugural chair. Dr. B.B. King came when she passed away. Bobby Rush came on board when B.B. passed away. Clifton Talbert is our national spokesperson, but virtually every entity that we have asked to support this endeavor, they have agreed to do so. So much so that even our state Senator Thad Cochran, the late great Thad Cochran, wrote this wonderful letter in tribute to us as well. We have sent President Obama this statue, and so we expect to see it in his presidential library as soon as it is open to the public. And of course, the Clarion Ledger, who did a beautiful front page Sunday coverage of this effort by Monica Land. It was so well written, honoring the struggle that we have underway. And this is a continuation of that story. It was great. So currently, we are still looking for artifacts and photos and stories and quilts, contemporary oral history. So if you know anyone who has ever picked cotton, we're looking for those stories. We want to make them into plays and manuscripts and books. And of course, we're looking for financial support. This whole project will cost us $26 million. And I'm sure there's someone listening to this presentation today who can just simply write that check and send it on. We'll be so happy. And in the words of our great inaugural chair, Dr. Maya Angelou, she left us with these marching orders. She said, scarred, rough, chained black hands full of fluffy, cloud-like white cotton, a poignant picture of American history. We have all come far, former black slaves and former white slave owners, all trying to live free and fair lives in our American present. We have far to go. But let us be proud that we have come this far with courage. We must not be crippled with our guilt nor with hate. It is imperative that we remember our history, for it is true. One who does not learn from history is doomed to repeat it. This is me and the king and me. Yes, even he was a cotton picker. And he wrote a letter saying, basically, I give you permission. I'm going to do whatever Maya says she would do. I'll do it. And Honey Boy Edwards was a friend of mine. And he came over to my house and actually picked cotton for me. This is that man who, at the age of 14, would be beaten every day if he did not make his quota of at least 500 pounds of cotton. And he would be beaten by his father because they had a quota, and the family would get kicked off of the plantation if they did not meet their quota. So, the legacy in summary: the Americans who survived enslavement left us legacies that shape life in this nation every day. The legacy, having persisted through our worst moments, they help us to see the best in ourselves. They help us to uncover what has too long been hidden in our past and help us find resources to continue our long national experiment with liberty. Its legacy, its tradition, and its influences are soaked in unaccountable historic pain and bloodshed throughout the world. The opportunity costs of slavery and sharecropping are both incalculable and unknowable. And its proceeds continue to provide financial comfort to the powers that be, along with the inclination to forego peace, love, and the well-being for the working majority in the pursuit of selfish monetary profits for only a few. So I invite you all to please help us out by being a part of the movement to preserve the legacy and to finally say thank you. So let's build this monument together, my people. And I do indeed thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, both of you, for that. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone in the audience has questions, and it looks like my camera may be gummed up a little bit, so I apologize if that's the case for y'all, but I hope you can hear me at least. Dr. Turnipseed, let me make you put down your coffee mug. I'm sorry about that. And ask, can you talk to us a little bit about the support that you've gotten for the project, but also some of the resistance, some of the reluctance from some Black families to revisit and sort of subject themselves to that era again?
Yeah, the support, well, we haven't officially began to ask for any real financial support other than the purchasing of the miniature monument that Ed Dwight has constructed or created for this campaign. But you're right with the struggle, and I kind of sensed that even in my voice and my tone as I was talking. I was wondering, why am I so dreary, in my presentation? Because it's a really, really sad thing, and it's just laden with all of the pain and the memory. And we have to remember that that's how blues was evoked. Just that soothing sound of the blues from the ancient African rhythms helped to just calm those emotions and those feelings down. And I get major resistance. And I'll just tell you real quickly what my father said and how he responded, he and my mom, who are from Mississippi and who did pick cotton. And when I first went home to San Francisco and brought them a bowl of cotton and placed it in my father's hands, he had lost his eyesight at that point and didn't see it coming. And so he was trying to figure it out. And then he's like, "What is this?" And it was like, I put it in his hand like that. And then he was like, "What is that?" He said, "Is this a handkerchief? You brought me a handkerchief from Mississippi?" I said, "No, Daddy, that's cotton." Ah! He screamed. He looked in my direction. He cursed at me. And my father doesn't curse, and especially at me. And then so I was like, and my mother was over there shaking her head saying, "That child just don't understand." And I was like, "Understand what? And why is it that y'all never told us anything about cotton? Why is it that you don't?" The pain was real. And so that's how I actually found my passion with cotton, is just trying to figure out what the hell happened to people who picked cotton. What was that experience like? And to finally give respect and dignity and honor by simply saying thank you and building some sort of a monument or that pays tribute to all that labor. So yeah, the pain is real. That's all.
Well, yeah, and along those lines, could you tell us a little bit about some of the conversations that have gone on about whether to include plantings of cotton in the memorial?
And you mean the historic site that we have plans for?
Yes.
Yeah, it does have a presence,
Right.
and it does have an open field. Again, once I present like this information pretty much in a scholarly, if you will, or a respectful way that shows the fact that cotton was the number one, commodity for nearly 200 years. It's the reason Wall Street is the reason for this and that and the other, and how valuable that contribution to this economy, how important it is. People start to have a different perspective, on their contributions. But again, I think the pain and the resistance comes from the fact that they were never paid, they were never acknowledged, and never officially thanked. And it was John Jarvis at the National Park Services who said, "Yeah, it's time. It's time that we do something in this regard for cotton, because nothing has been done." So, so I just have to push through the pain, and I feel it myself, even though I'm an honorary cotton picker. I went out there with my gloves and some scissors and acted like I was picking cotton, and they kicked me out. They kicked me out of the yard saying, "Get out of here with that." But the thing is we have to find a way.
Yeah.
We have to find a way to honor that contribution.
Dr. Charles, let me ask you, and you may have mentioned this, and I may have just missed it at the beginning, but do we know what the incident was that spurred the overseer to want to take action?
Oh, no, I wish we did.
Yeah.
But no, we don't know.
And was the 75-man mob, was that extra legal? Was the sheriff involved? What exactly was how would you characterize the nature of that?
Given that they wind up in the jail, some of them, I would semi-extra legal-ish. So no, I don't know if the sheriff was involved. Rounding up, but nobody died, so that's kind of a good sign. They had the judge that you had just retired from the high court preside over this. We don't really know. I
Yeah.
wonder if this is something that happens more regularly than we realize, but because it, made the press because of Mrs. Polk.
Right.
But then I haven't seen anything else like this in the Yalobusha County docket that I went through from the time period. So
Yeah. We have a question for you here in the chat from Sarah Campbell, who asks, when you find stories such as the one who shared about Mrs. Polk's plantation that seem to be contrary to what we think we understand about slavery, what conclusions do you draw? Is every individual situation and power dynamic different, or are these discernible patterns in various states under different legal system legacies, i.e. colonial, et cetera?
So that's an interesting question. I think we have to continue to conclude that slavery is bad, and whether people are beaten to death extrajudicially or not. On the other hand, humans are human, and we tend to do things different. We don't always respond the same way. Like I told you a moment ago, I wonder whether there were things like this that happened but just weren't captured in the courts. Maybe they actually took this to court because Mrs. Polk was an absentee landowner and they thought they needed to do something about it, and they didn't trust the overseer to deal with it. Yes, every situation and power dynamic are different. I do lean towards the notion that knowing that ownership had been fairly stable for that group for 15 or 20 years. I didn't bring this up because 20 minutes is very short, but President Polk had bought this plantation and these enslaved people as sort of a 401k for him and his wife. This was going to be what they were going to live off of. And then he died right after he got out of, after he finished his one term. So she hadn't really bought in more people. The community was there. And Mr. Mayers, the overseer, had been the overseer for longer than other earlier overseers had been. So I'm sorry, Sarah, I wish I knew the answer.
It's a fair and honest answer. Dr. Turnipseed,
Yes.
There were enslaved people who picked cotton. There were sharecroppers who picked cotton. There were also Black landowners who raised and picked cotton. Can you say a few words about the importance of Black land ownership in the 20th century and to the movement?
To the historic site development movement?
Well, just sort of the significance of Black land ownership in general, I suppose.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Black land ownership, entrepreneurship, just having that freedom or that ability and the resources available to you to build and to develop. There's no wonder and our mystery that, we have that urging, that need, that agency, that wanting to have our own businesses and land to grow. That was one of the major demands coming out of enslavement and during Reconstruction, and what the whole 40 acres and a mule, that being something that was requested by those Savannah ministers at the time. And yeah, it's very important. Again, having that self-determination and wanting and being able to live in a place that isn't prohibited by law, and policy and other social constraints, and just hatred, really, to prevent them from having and doing those things that they truly want to do. And again, the examples are set. And all of the historically Black towns, you know, the preference is to just be in a place where they feel safe and where they're not harassed and stepped upon and burned out and bombed and all the other things that have happened over the years. So, you know, I can speak forever about how important that is, of course, you know,
Yeah.
to all of us.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and as Dr. Childs notes, the time that we have allowed for you each is not is not nearly enough as we would wish. That being the case, I will ask just in sort of bullet form, Dr. Childs. You mentioned the application for military pensions. Do you have some information that you're you know, about the military actions of the two while they were in the USCT?
I sure do. The 10 of them enlisted. In fact, we have a descendant of Manuel has just joined us, which is pretty cool too.
Yeah.
They joined one of the Western Tennessee regiments that became the 51st USCT, I believe, and went off. Giles died before he came back. Manuel did not. Most of the men came back, and the Giles and Manuel's civil pension applications have been digitized by Fold 3, which is how I came across this story. I was looking, actually, I have a white relative named Avent, and I was up here in Arkansas. I was trying to find him, and I was familiar with what Civil War pension files look like, and the ones that I was familiar with never started off with, I was formerly owned by President James K. Polk. And so this is a super interesting story. Giles's widow is a favorite of mine because after he dies, I mean, like 20 years later, she has to file for a pension application. Comes to find out that there's sort of I like to think that this was a fraud being committed on Giles after he died. It might have been that he took up with a woman in Memphis. At any rate, he died. This woman in Memphis filed for a pension and obtained it in like 1865, 66. 20 years later, Daphne has lined up legal help. I think lawyers were working up the pension obtaining system, and she's trying to get a pension, and they're like, oh no, somebody else has already claimed on Giles. And she had to stick it out, prove that they were married, and all of the thing, you know, brings it, gets some money for some of her children, and then but she's like, my daughter Belle, she's been kicked out of the church for too much dancing. And so there's just the fact that they've sent in people to take the depositions of these formerly enslaved people gives you a really interesting window into, but none of them, nobody mentions that they spent 2 years in jail.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can see from the birth gap,
Right.
besides the records, that it's true. They weren't just wandering around.
Well, it's a fascinating story. We're glad we've gotten to hear as much of it today as we could. Dr. Turnipseed, always great to hear from you. Thank you so much for this, both of you.
Can I do a quick?
Sure.
A quick shout out to Deirdre Payne, who I've known for almost all my life, it seems, and I see her in the chat. I just want to say hi, Deirdre. Okay.
Deirdre lays it down. All right. Thank you both. Marshall Bennett, thank you for your service this year, and I'm going to turn this back over to you for your remarks.
Well, that is good. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies, for your presentation. We appreciate all the work you put on this project. Stay tuned with us because we are going to conclude with a ceremony. For me, this has been an unusual year to be president of the Mississippi Historical Society. We've witnessed the lows of a pandemic and the highs of a new state flag. Therefore, it is now my honor to pass the gavel to our incoming president, Millsaps Professor Stephanie Roth. Stephanie just sent us a message and said she had to leave the meeting for a family emergency and that she would catch up with us next week, very soon. So Stephanie, we wish you well on your year as president. and with no problems like we've had this year. And I am proud to pass this gavel, even though it may be remotely, to you, and wish you the best of luck next year on your presidency. Speaking of next year, our next meeting will be March the 3rd and 4th of 2022 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And guess what? We're planning on it to be in person, not remotely. So we hope to see you all there next year, and we'll get this to Stephanie and make the ceremony official. Thank you very much.